If you've spent some time on the internet lately, you've definitely heard the term male loneliness epidemic. It is used to describe a seemingly new phenomenon which makes it hard for men to find significant others or connect with other people, especially women. According to the online narrative, this loneliness is caused by feminism and the leftist agenda. According to a lot of men, or maybe we should rather call them incels, they are suffering because brainwashed women aren't giving them a chance. And according, of course, to the same incels, it is because the feminist agenda has messed with young women's minds and they forgot about the most important values like family or marriage. Apparently, the situation is so bad that many men are suffering. They bring up mental health issues and the rising suicide rates as proof that the equality movement is happening at their expense. While I don't want to diminish someone's struggles by any means, I would like to show you that this is not a gendered issue. According to research, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it is more of a generational issue. It's not the male loneliness epidemic, but rather a Gen Z loneliness epidemic. Somehow, we don't see women complaining about being lonely, or at least not so much that it deserves to be described as a whole phenomenon. Why is all the focus on men? Maybe they had different expectations based on what they observed in the lives of their fathers. Or maybe it's women who sweep the problem under the rug and pretend like everything is okay. And why is Gen Z so lonely in the first place? Is it really feminism? Or maybe there is more to the story. Although the narrative that men are more lonely than women seems very convenient for a lot of people, it isn't entirely true. Even when you think about it logically, in terms of romantic relationships, that wouldn't make any sense. First of all, there is approximately the same amount of men and women in the world. According to the United Nations World Population Prospect, in the overall population, men comprise 50.4% and women 39.6%. What's more, in Western countries like US or UK, there is slightly more women than men. So if men were alone at such an alarming rate, then logically women would be too. And sure, when we look at the situation like this, we are forgetting about homosexual relationships. Maybe there is a lot of lesbian women, and that's why men can't find significant others. But according to Gallup, in the US, 2.4% of men identify as gay and 1% of women identify as lesbian. 1.6% and 4.3% respectively identify as bisexual. So those disproportions aren't high enough to explain more men being alone than women. And of course, young men can be more alone because young women tend to date older men more often than the other way around. However, there is only around 10% of heterosexual couples where a man is 10 or more years older, and around 2% where a woman is that much older. So it still seems like too small of a difference to cause a widespread loneliness among men. So, are they? Are they really more lonely, especially in terms of romantic relationships? It's difficult to answer this question. When it comes to experiencing loneliness as a feeling or state, men and women experience it at very similar rates. A December 2021 survey of US adults revealed that 57% of men and 59% of women felt lonely, suggesting minimal gender differences in overall loneliness levels. According to Pew Research Center, about 1 in 6 Americans, or 16%, say they feel lonely or isolated from those around them all or most of the time, including roughly equal shares of men and women. About 4 in 10 adults, or 38%, say they sometimes feel lonely, and 47% say they hardly ever or never do. While experiences with loneliness don't differ much by gender, they do differ significantly by age. Feelings of loneliness, however, don't have to be based in reality. What I mean by that is that sometimes, even in a relationship, you can feel very alone, especially if your partner doesn't provide the emotional support you need or if you have troubles building intimacy. So let's quickly look at the data concerning relationships. I'm going to focus on young adults or Gen Z specifically because naturally there is less single people in older age groups. The oldest of Gen Z are about 28 years old now, so in our culture it's still relatively young to get married, and a lot of people don't decide to tie the knot until a bit later. So I don't think it makes sense to compare relationship status between different age groups in that context. Though it was hard to find reliable data for this, I found a survey of 250 Gen Zs carried out by Archival. According to its results, half of Gen Z women said they are in a relationship, while only 24% of Gen Z men agreed. Sure, Gen Z women are more likely to identify as lesbian or bisexual and may be in same sex relationships, but statistically speaking, this doesn't explain the gap between single identifying men and women. So, that part of the loneliness epidemic is true. There are more Gen Z women in relationships than men. However, that doesn't explain why loneliness is experienced at similar levels regardless of gender, but does differ significantly by age. So, in light of this data, is Gen Z more alone than other generations? The simple answer is yes. Gen Z is by far the loneliest generation. Citing a Cigna survey from 2023. Loneliness, which can leave people feeling anxious, disconnected, and emotionally isolated, now affects 58% of adults in the United States. Our continuing research shows that loneliness has increased steadily from 46% in 2018 to 58% in 2023, a 12 percentage point increase over the 5-year period. In 2018, Generation Z adults were the loneliest generation, followed by millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers, respectively. This trend in generational loneliness continued into 2023. Gen Z adults are still the loneliest, with 71% feeling lonely, followed by millennials, 65%, Gen X, 59%, and baby boomers, 44%. In 2023, 58% of men perceived themselves to be lonely, up from 50% just a year earlier. Comparatively, women's loneliness increased from 55% in 2022 to 57% in 2023. Similar data comes from research conducted in Poland. The report No More Loneliness shows that as many as 65% of young people aged 13 to 28 admit to having such a condition, meaning loneliness. Over 32% declare that they feel it often and 33% sometimes. When asked about the emotions that accompany them in moments of loneliness, they mainly indicate sadness and helplessness. So clearly, loneliness is not a gendered issue, but it's a problem of our generation. But what led us here? There is probably a number of reasons why our generation is so disconnected, but to me, two of them are most conspicuous: technology and the COVID-19 pandemic. Gen Z is probably the first generation that grew up surrounded by technology. Sure, millennials were also introduced to it rather early, but definitely not as early as we were. According to a survey, older millennials got their first cell phone at an average age of 20. Younger millennials started at 16. Gen Zers had their own phones by the time they were 12. And the data about Gen Z is probably focused more on older Gen Z, because a lot of me and my friends got our first phones at the beginning of primary school, so probably around 7 or 8 years old. There is no denying that using technology from a very young age shapes our relationships with people around us. Kids get out less to play and spend more time communicating through the internet. I think that this causes social skills to decline or not properly develop. That is why so many people in our generation struggle with basic social tasks, get overwhelmed at work or in other social situations. Even more so, according to the Cigna study I mentioned before, that is what causes the loneliness epidemic in our generation. One reason why younger people may feel more isolated may be their greater tendency to use social media. The study found an increasing correlation between social media usage and feelings of loneliness. 7 out of 10 heavy social media users reported feelings of loneliness, up from 53% a year ago. That compares to 51% of light social media users feeling lonely, up from 47 a year ago. So, we grew up with our phones in hand, getting more and more isolated, and then, when we hit young adulthood, the pandemic happened. We all ended up socially isolating and being encouraged to stay away from other people, as it may be a danger not just to us, but our loved ones and anyone else we came into contact with. 1 year after the end of COVID-19 pandemic restrictions in California, adolescents reported an increase in feeling disconnected from their communities and negative thoughts about society in general. The study found extensive decreases in social well-being, and a significant portion of the students failed to rebound to their pre-COVID level by 2022. In 2019, 45% of survey respondents said that they contributed to society daily or more often, compared to 31% who reported this sentiment in 2022. Once again, this shows that the hardship that led to increased loneliness are not just men's problem. They touch women in our generation just as much. So underlining it as a solely men's issue is what is actually dividing us even more. So why are we only hearing the men's perspective? Research done by Pew Center shows an important trend. We also asked Americans where they would turn for emotional support if they needed it. Women are more likely than men to say they'd be extremely or very likely to turn to each of the following sources for this type of support: their mother, a friend, another family member who is not their parent, spouse, or partner, a mental health professional. Men and women are about equally likely to say they have at least one close friend, and most do. But men who have close friends don't communicate with them as often as women do. Higher shares of women than men say they send text messages, interact on social media, and talk on the phone or video chat with a close friend at least a few times a week. So it looks like even though men and women from our generation experience loneliness at similar rates, women tend to look for support among their own gender, while men don't. There is a lot to be said about that, and it would probably be enough material for a whole other video. But I think there are some obvious reasons, like social conditioning, for example. Men are taught to not show their emotions or share them with others. That's why they may be feeling so alone, even though realistically they experience it at the same rates as women. And that is definitely a sad fact. It's horrible that men, even today, have troubles with intimacy and connecting with others. However, instead of blaming the patriarchal norms that shaped them like that, they point their fingers at women who supposedly don't want to accommodate them anymore. But what is dividing our generation like that? Usually, men and women from one generation follow similar trends when it comes to topics like gender equality or politics. Sure, usually women tend to be more feminist for obvious reasons, but the difference between genders isn't huge. However, it's different with Gen Z. The research found that individuals belonging to Gen Z are more divided than any other generation on a host of topics. Whether they define themselves as a feminist, whether a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man, whether men are being expected to do too much to support equality, and whether we've gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men. Some 53% of Gen Z women, for example, agree with the statement that they define themselves as a feminist, while only 32% of Gen Z men do. a huge 21 percentage point gap. For millennials, the respective proportions are 46 and 32%, a 14 percentage point gap, while for Gen X respondents, they are 37 and 29%, an 8-point difference. Similarly, 19% of Gen Z women said that they thought a man who stays at home to look after his children is less of a man, compared to 28% of men in the same generational cohort. That 9 percentage point gap is more than double the gap for millennials and Gen X when asked the same question. The study, based on a survey of nearly 24,000 people across 30 nations, also finds that although people perceive less tension between men and women than between other groups in society, such as rich and poor people, Gen Z are more likely than older generations to feel there is tension between genders in their country. 6 in 10 Gen Z men agree men are being expected to do too much to support equality, 22 points higher than the 38% of Gen Z women. Again, this is the largest generational gender divide on this question, with the next biggest gap among Gen X, where there is a 17-point difference in opinion between men and women. Around 57% of Gen Z men also say we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men, compared with around a third of Gen Z women who hold this opinion. This gap of 21 percentage points is larger than among any other generation surveyed, with the next biggest divide among Gen X, where the split in agreement is 18 points. And there lies the reason for the supposed male loneliness epidemic, or rather, like I said before, the Gen Z loneliness epidemic. Women in our generation strive for equality probably because they can see that even though on the institutional level we are supposedly equal to men, we aren't on a social level. Men, I think especially in our generation, still treat us like less of a human. They would like girlfriends or future wives who not only take upon themselves the majority of the housework, but also contribute 50-50 financially. They seem to use feminism against us to demand equal shares in finances while not delivering equal shares in housework or emotional labor in a relationship. What's more, the rise of alpha male influencers and podcasters such as Andrew Tate or Myron Gaines only further reinforces those convictions. They are trying to convince young men that women are less than them and their places in the kitchen. However, young women know that it's not true and they can live on their own, avoiding treatment like that from men. They can get jobs on their own and live their lives completely independently. They know they don't have to subject themselves to disrespect from men. While those alpha male influencers have an impact on men, they clearly don't have as much impact on women. We refuse to accept their narrative because it has nothing to do with the reality we live in. Although old jokes like feminism ends when she needs to lift a fridge still circulate, they increasingly lose touch with reality as time goes on. As much as some men would love for their physical strength to be enough to get women to like them in any way, it's not. It was definitely easier for previous generations of men because women were dependent on them in a lot of ways. Until 1974, women in the US couldn't even open a bank account without a man. Now, women expect more because they can do more than their mothers or grandmothers. They don't need a man to stay afloat, so they actually raise their standards to find someone who respects them and whom they can build a solid relationship with. But men seem to refuse to acknowledge the changes. And as much as some of them would like the world to go back to what it was, it won't. Even though women still don't have completely equal rights, like to the autonomy of their bodies, for example, it is impossible to close them in houses again. And the simple reason here is capitalism. If someone now banned half the working force from earning money, everything would crumble. In my opinion, in the era of young women still fighting for equality, men are just behind. They seem to still cling to the idea that a woman should be their servant. They are telling stories about their mothers who worked long hours and then would come back home to cook meals, clean, and take care of children. From the men's perspective, that is the ideal woman or wife, one that does it all, just like their mothers did. But from a young woman's perspective, our mothers were overworked and undervalued. We've seen our mothers do it all with often little to no help from men. We now live in times when we actually don't need a man for survival. We can get jobs and bank accounts, we can live alone and enjoy our time however we want it. Very often, men add no value to our life. And sure, emotional support and intimacy are still invaluable for a lot of young women. But very often, men don't offer that. They keep talking about their expectations, both in terms of physical appearance and general personality, but they themselves seem to offer either money or their physical strength, thinking that's enough. But we really don't need that anymore. So, when a relationship happens at the expense of our freedom, and in return, we don't even get the emotional support and intimacy, for a lot of us, it's just not worth it. We would rather be alone than smothered by a man just for the sake of eventually maybe getting married. Because a marriage like this does not make our life easier, it actually makes it harder.